kind of rewiring the brain, but we can rewire the brain at very different parts in the life. And we can do it in different ways. We can do it through physical activity. We can do it through health habits. We can do it through lack of smoking. We can do it with more education. And so all those things, we can really reduce the burden in the population and on families and communities.
It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Mark Hayward. He is at the University of Texas at Austin Centennial Commission, liberal arts professor of sociology. He's a faculty research associate of the Population Research Center and director of the Population Health Initiative at the University of Texas at Austin, of course, UT. I'll just call it UT from now on, Mark. How's that sound?
That's great.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. And, I talk a lot on our shows about population, what it means for the economy, what it means to our culture and our future. And fertility rates are way down in the US, in Western Europe, in Russia, in Japan, and China is going to really take it on the chin for their one child policy in about 9 years. I guess they're going to really start seeing that. What do you make of all this, and what are some of the big ideas? And then let's drill down.
All right. So I think we talked a little bit earlier about the actual declining population. So we have countries where for the first time they're literally going down in numbers. And you see this actually quite locally in some places. So Japan is a really good example of where you have entire communities that are declining. So there's this kind of tension between population and technology and consumption and production that is kind of the laws or the rules, if you will, are being rewritten as we speak. I think we're getting into some uncharted territory. I don't think there's any worries in my mind about what the future will be like, but I think we're going to have to be adjusting to changes in population sizes, population composition, who produces what, and there are usually solutions, and sometimes they're both demographic solutions and they're economic solutions.
So let's look at the US. Of course, we kind of alluded to what's going on around the world, but the vast majority of listeners are in the US. The US is the largest economy in the world, at least for the time being, and really has the biggest influence. If it weren't for our liberal immigration policies, we would really see a much older population in the US, wouldn't we?
Yes, absolutely. It's really our immigration policies that have allowed us to be younger. There's a little bit of a blip of higher fertility for the new immigrants. As they acculturate, then we see, fertility patterns that coincide with the rest of the population. But yeah, it's really that which has allowed us to be in some ways economically healthy.
Yeah. So you mentioned Japan, and in Japan, I think the median age is like 48 or
Right.
something. It's
Right.
staggeringly old. Not that that's old, but for a median age, it sure is. And in the US, it's about 38, I believe. Correct me
Right.
if I'm wrong on any of this. Fertility rates need to be 2.1 to just maintain the population.
Right.
We're way under that, aren't we? What's going to come of us?
I'm not as I hate to be a doomsayer. One of the things to remember is that some people think demography is destiny. It is not destiny. It's kind of like a necessary but not sufficient condition when you get into a lot of these kinds of social change and economic issues. So I hesitate to put it, you can use demography and demographic solutions to kind of deal with these problems. So the immigration policy is a good example. The US has an immigration policy that allows new people and younger people in, and immigrants are young. Japan does not have an immigration policy that allows new people in, and despite, the Japanese could use that demographic solution, but they choose not to.
Right, right. And China can't solve their problem with immigration because you can't import 700 million people very easily, which is what China will need by about
Yeah,
the mid-century or
yeah.
so.
That's a
Um,
size issue. It's really a size issue.
right, right. You go into, regional areas, you go into types of jobs, just tell us what this all means.
So I've done a lot of work lately on geographic differences in mortality, and in particular, looking at how states are diverging in their life expectancies and how inequality across those states. And this has been going on for a long time, but it's really driven by whether states invest in their populations and whether states basically de-invest in their population. So it's quite sensitive. This kind of inequality in some ways is driving our overall national trends. So you have to get, when you look at national trends, you have to kind of go under the hood, so to speak, and figure out, well, what is driving this declining life expectancy? So that's just an example of the kinds of ways in which, policy factors are playing out, and they've been in operation for quite some time.
Talk to us about the different states, if you would. Mortality or life expectancy varies quite a bit from state to state.
Yeah, I think that the gap between the highest and lowest life expectancy in the United States is larger than the gap between all high income countries. So we have some states that basically look like developing nations, and unfortunately, these are concentrated in the South, such as Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama. And we have other states that look a lot like Northern Europe. And forgive the comparison, but Minnesota as an example. But other states like Massachusetts and New York and even California have quite high life expectancies. So, I mean, the divide, we could see something like 4.5 years difference between the highest and lowest states and their life expectancies.
So is it the food choices? I mean, the food in Louisiana is deep fried and it tastes good, you know?
In some ways, there's a kind of macro factors that are coming into play. So we've changed the way it ran its social welfare programs, and we shifted them back to the states. And some states are really good at managing those programs, and other states are not so good at managing those programs. And then we had a kind of shift in the economic policy, which was in some states, they really got rid of regulation. And that results in kind of inequality within kind of a deindustrialization in some parts of the state. And other parts are very well off, and states are going to differ in that. So those factors play out. Those are kind of macro factors that play out over the long term, and they have long-term consequences for mortality of a variety of types, not just COVID, but cardiovascular diseases and metabolic diseases. Those are the factors that have been dividing the states for decades.
So I would say definitely the sort of outdoorsy and healthy kind of environments and the food choices have a lot to do with that. Maybe smoking as well.
I mean, I think of all the things that you've mentioned, smoking patterns are a really good example.
Uh-huh.
I'll give you another example. So, do you know how much the excise tax on a pack of cigarettes is in Mississippi?
I do not know, but
It's
I'm guessing it's low there,
55 cents on a pack.
right? Okay, what's
So
it like in
in
California?
Minnesota, it's about $4 a pack.
Huge difference.
So the difference across when I talk about policy and how it's related to individuals' choices, there really is a correspondence between these kinds of policies and how people are going to behave. And there's a dose response relationship between how much you charge an excise tax for cigarettes and whether the population smokes.
So sin taxes work. That's your point, right?
Yeah, I mean, and especially given how wide the differences are in the syntaxes that we're
Right.
seeing.
Well, it's an 8x multiple, basically. Yeah. Oh,
Exactly.
huge difference, huge difference. So, what about the aging population and what that means for the economy? One of the things, and I know you're not an economist, so I understand that, but just broadly speaking, and I'll chime in on it, of course. But one of the things I always say is I always tell my listeners and viewers, Mark, to watch old movies and old TV shows, and listen to old music and read old books. And in watching old movies and old TV shows, I am just struck when I look at movies and TV shows from, say, the 60s or the early 70s, at how large the population of young people was. In that baby boomer era, I mean, as they came of age, that's just, there were so many young people. And I thought, how fun that must have been, to have the social life that they had. I'm not saying I would have been a guy at Woodstock necessarily, but just the concept, right? But then I look at today, and the millennial generation is actually larger than the baby boomers by a small 4 million people or so, not that much, but larger. My generation, Gen X, is a tiny little generation nobody cares about. We're only like 46 million. But it's just so different now because it's so much more fragmented. The culture is, than it was back then when the baby boomers were around. They were all sort of doing the same thing, right?
Yeah.
That they were, they were anti-establishment. We were landing on the moon, Vietnam, like there was all these things that sort of, I don't know, united and divided people at the same time, but at least in their cohort, it more often united than divided in their demographic cohort, I think.
I think that's a really good observation about kind of social cohesion, and I think we've lost a lot of the ways in which we used to be able to kind of manage social cohesion. We did a good job. I mean, the church membership and church attendance has declined in dramatic numbers over the last few decades, so that's certainly changed. We've also become hyper politicized in the ways in which we approach life. So I think you're right in terms of how you think about the kind of shared values. I think we've become more segregated from each other in a variety of ways. And I live in Austin, Texas. People think, oh, what a lovely city, and it is, but it's also hyper segregated by economics. So and it's gotten more segregated as we've gotten to be a richer place. So I just use that as an example. I'll have one other example. There's the LBJ Ranch, which is where the Texas White House was when LBJ was the president of the United States. If you go out to the ranch and you walk through the ranch itself and you look at the living room, there were three TVs sitting there so that LBJ could watch the news:
Hmm.
ABC,
Yeah.
CBS, and NBC.
Yeah.
Right?
Three
Now,
networks, and now you have massive fragmentation of
now
it.
we have a massive fragmentation in the
Yeah.
media. Exactly. And I think that's the one thing we all watch the same. We all watch the same things on television. So
Back then. It's so interesting. Like, I never would have thought it would have necessarily turned out this way because you have the internet that you'd think would be this uniting force. We can bring everybody together, everybody can communicate with each other. But instead, we've all splintered off. And what's happened, I remember back, 20 ish years ago when the big scandal came out about the company DoubleClick. You might remember this.
yeah,
And it was because they were tracking people's online behavior. Oh, imagine that. Yes.
exactly right.
Now we've all accepted that as the norm. And, heck, if my computer goes down, I'll just ask the NSA for the backup of the hard drive.
I'd ask Amazon
Yeah.
myself. So
Or Amazon will have it, sure.
you know
Um,
more about my life than anyone.
Super scary, by the way, but we won't go down that rabbit hole at the moment. But the media has become so fragmented, and I don't mean like even broadcast media, but just the ads we see, the stuff we see in our news feeds. And what's happened is we're all becoming more like ourselves. We're all in this echo chamber that only reinforces our own worldview, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I
Whereas,
think
whereas before, when it wasn't fragmented, yes, we had this same worldview, like all Americans, right? Because there wasn't much difference between ABC, NBC, and CBS, or Newsweek and Time,
that,
or the LA Times and the New York Times, whatever. But now there's just a bazillion media outlets.
yeah, and I also think that in those days there was less ability to provide misinformation out there in the media as well. I mean, we were kind of good at self-policing because whatever CBS said, NBC and ABC were going to have to say it too. And now we have such a wide variety of sources, and people can pretty much find what they want. It fits with their worldviews and their belief structures. And I'm not talking about any one group. I'm talking about all groups, right?
Right.
All do. So
But the mainstream media has become so hyper politicized. I mean, it's not even a secret anymore. It's just out there. There's no journalism. That's pretty much just dead, sadly.
I would say that it probably is a reflection of the larger society in general. I don't see it as a cause, but I do see it as a consequence of the
Yeah.
ways in which we operate. So
So back to the population and what do we have to look forward to? I mean, we have the graying of America, we have immigration, some call that the browning of America. And so we have these trends. The immigrants are young, the fertility rates are higher, they're having children. The Americans that have been here a while, they're not having kids, they're going extinct, they're aging. This creates a lot of dependency where you got to have younger workers in the system to pay for programs for older workers. What's going to happen? Is retirement age going to extend and be much higher in the future? Just what do you see happening?
Yeah, I think this aging issue, again, I hate to say this, but the part of the issue is if you wanted to raise their normal retirement age, you have to think about how its broader impact is going to be across all the groups, not just the group that we happen to be associated with. You and I, we can probably work and live and be quite happy for a really extended period of our lives. And so if they change the retirement age, it wouldn't really matter. But that's not the case for a lot of Black Americans and Hispanic Americans who work in different kinds of jobs. And so you have this government's always going to be faced with this policy, one size has to fit all. Where do I kind of come out in the middle? And then if that's not going to change, I mean, I'm not a very pessimistic person when it comes to our future. I'm a pretty optimistic person, and I think that's because we have a lot of tools at our disposal. One of the tools that we have kind of forgotten about is education and the ways in which education can play out. And I don't know how many of your listeners realize this, but we're one of the least educated countries of the developed nations that there is out there in the world. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to go to college, but there is high, other countries have higher rates of secondary education,
Oh,
and
sure.
so I think that's one factor that can really contribute. And I think you see states. Tennessee was a state recently that said, well, let's open up and let's look at the providing junior college free to Tennessee state residents, which is a quite innovative approach when you think about it. And they're a fairly conservative state, so you don't think of them as being innovative, and yet they are. They understand the value in which they can improve their residents. So
Junior college isn't very expensive. I mean, I went to junior college and,
exactly.
of course, that was a while back, but it was cheap and it's still pretty cheap, is my understanding. What I object to is Harvard University wanting to charge people $49,000 to watch college on Zoom. That's just criminal. I mean, the cost of some of these schools. I mean, look, you're in that world, right? I mean, you're at a public school, so it's different, but it's just
I'm,
beyond
I'm a
ridiculous.
dad.
What?
I'm a father whose son went to college, and
Yeah.
and I said, and here's Jason, I don't know, forgive me if we're telling a personal story, but I said to my son, Daddy will buy you a brand new car if you go to a state university.
Yeah.
If you go to a private university,
Bribery. Yeah.
you know,
And
and
it
my
would have been cheaper for daddy. Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So being the Y chromosome kid that he is, he opted for the car, which was, on my wallet, it was much better. And part of it is how much extra value does it do certain kinds of education buy you at certain stages of your life. So, I mean, I won't get into the kinds of pros and cons of, that kind of, but people do have more flexibility sometimes than they think they do in terms of pursuing educational opportunities. So, and they sometimes you don't want to cut off opportunities like junior college as a way of getting into even higher education.
Yeah. Right. Right. Since we're talking about education and you're obviously in that world, what do you think about accreditation? And I don't know how that system works on the back end of this, but the fact that you can go online and you can teach yourself pretty much anything on Skillshare, YouTube, the Khan Academy, all of these fantastic educational resources we have nowadays that are basically free or incredibly cheap.
Yeah.
And why is it that colleges aren't using technology to scale the way everything else is using technology to scale? Well, obviously, there's a financial incentive not to. Why would you have to limit enrollment at any college? I mean, your classes could be live streamed to a billion students, and we could have the best professor at every subject on earth teach everybody who wanted to be learning from that professor. And then if you say that, well, it's not just teaching and giving lectures one to many, but it's also grading them, right? Well, I mean, that can be done with technology too. I mean, in my day they had Scantron. Okay, they've got better stuff now. So There's just no incentive. It's kind of like the labor unions not wanting to adopt technology because, heck, it'll put people out of their jobs. But that is temporary, right? People retool, they adapt to technology.
Well, maybe they don't retool and maybe they don't adapt, but new people come along and take their place. And I think there's a kind of cohort succession that goes on with that. This idea of frictional unemployment is really one that, people aren't as retooling as you think they are. They're quite sticky in the skill sets in which they operate.
Tell us more about that.
But, so we have a situation in a lot of places where we had some deindustrialization that went on, and we had educational policies that were geared towards attracting those workers back to uh, like, let's say, community colleges and so forth for retraining programs into quite lucrative positions, and yet uh, older workers, especially prime-aged workers, 40 years of age and older, were very reluctant to take advantage of those kinds of programs. So, programs may be there. The programs actually have been there. Whether people are interested in taking advantage of them or not is another issue. So there's kind of this disconnect between what we have and what we could be doing, but what we are doing. So, this is actually this question about low labor force participation rates, especially among white males, white prime-aged males, has been quite a concern for a number of years, at the Department of Labor. The one thing I want to tell you about this issue of education in the mass, I mean, I don't have a problem with large mass education, and to some extent. I think we can do more with scaling than we are. I do think there's a limit in terms of, if you at the point in which you think of education as actually developing cognitive skills, analytical skills, engaging and create synthesizing and being on the creative side, that does involve much more personal, interpersonal kinds of communication. Schooling, which is a different, it's not necessarily education, but it is the imparting of facts and basic knowledge. So parts of chemistry can be taught quite easily. Some parts of math might be taught that way. But at the point at which you are moving to a different, from schooling into education, you have to rethink the model. So actually think, Jason, a hybrid model at some point we could do a lot more with. And I think we learned a lot when last year many of us taught via Zoom, where the successes can be had and where the failures are still endemic. But clearly we have to be more flexible. I absolutely agree with you on that flexibility issue.
So accreditation seems to be the bottleneck. Many big companies, even Google, is saying they'll hire people without college degrees now, whereas before they insisted on it. But it seems like there could be so many more institutions, like we could have this startup culture in higher education if it wasn't for this accreditation bottleneck. And I just don't know how that works. Like, why do we have accreditation? And why can't more institutions get it?
Well, I think part of it is that you saw these for-profits education
Yeah.
programs.
There's a lot of those were scammy, right?
They were scammy, right? I mean, and we have to be honest about that kind of stuff. It's great to let the market roam, but at some point the market gets out of control.
I think the reason for that, by the way, and if you're talking about like the University of Phoenix back, I remember years ago reading about that, they were getting like homeless people to enroll in college so they could get the government money. But that's the problem. There's too much money in it. If there wasn't so much money in it, there wouldn't be all this fraud, right? There's all fraud because there's money there, right? If it was just inexpensive, it wouldn't be worth it for the criminals. Look at marijuana, for example. They decriminalized it in like 18 states, and the price just plummets through the floor. Nobody smuggles marijuana anymore, hardly. It's just not worth it, right? They only smuggle the illegal drugs because the fact that they're illegal gives them this monopoly on pricing power. Just like, big tech companies and other big companies have these semi monopolies, right? So they have pricing power. And that's what universities have. They
Yeah,
have this
I,
pricing power.
I know much less about accreditation,
Yeah.
but you are right, though, that there is this kind of norm that has developed, Jason, about I have some sort of job, like an office manager job, but I'm going to require that applicants have a college education. And so there has been this kind of magical norm that has developed in the economy over the last, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, where realistically, you don't need the skill set that someone would have coming out of college. And I think that's an issue that we should be addressing head on.
Yeah. I just wish the Khan Academy, for example, could become accredited and Skillshare could become accredited, and then someone who doesn't have the money to go to college or someone who's just really interested in self education could get some certifications from this and show those to an employer, and that would level them up. Right now, you just have no idea. The only metric is, do you have a college degree or do you not? And maybe here's an assessment test and we'll interview you and see what we think, right? That's it.
My son's in tech.
Hmm.
Oh, he works for Apple. He has to get one set of certifications after another in order to move along in his career.
Hmm.
It's expensive,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, and that's what it's become, and it kind of the technology has gone in lots of different ways across lots of different fields.
Yeah. Yeah. It really has. It's something else. Well, what else do you want to tell us about population and any of the stuff you're studying or teaching right now?
There's a new study that came out today from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. I was part of a group that wrote a new decadal study that was looking into the next 10 years of research into dementia. And I think that's certainly an issue that our country is facing simply because of the graying of the older population. One of the things that this report gets into, though, is that dementia is not inevitable, that it varies in fundamental ways. It's very socially patterned. But among those people who ultimately get it, there's no real easy pathway to navigate, either for yourself or for your caregivers. And I think we're going to face problems such as that, where people are living longer, or they may not be living longer in better health.
Right.
I think those are the kinds of challenges that we're going to face no matter what our mortality is, because ultimately it's going to come down to how long we live in high quality years where we have our health. So that's a question that we almost never get into.
So, any solutions, or is it just the miracle new treatment? Is that what we're
No, I
kind of
think
waiting for?
right now we've had no new treatments, and I know the FDA was.
Oh, I'm not saying there is one. I'm saying looking forward. Yeah.
I think right now there are so many differences between, let's say, college educated people and less educated people in terms of the levels of dementia. It's unbelievable. So, I mean, it's one of those things that we're kind of rewiring the brain, but we can rewire the brain at very different parts in the life. And we can do it in different ways. We can do it through physical activity. We can do it through health habits. We can do it through lack of smoking. We can do it with more education. And so all those things, we can really reduce the burden in the population and on families and communities.
Yeah.
So, in some ways I'm optimistic, but there is no easy way right now. There's no way to wrap care around an individual that's diagnosed with dementia at the moment. So
Is there science to having an active mind and being educated staves off dementia and Alzheimer's?
absolutely,
Right.
absolutely. There are years difference in terms of the ages when people are facing high risk uh, for dementia, right? And there are vast differences is should you get dementia and the number of years that you would live with dementia. So the more educated you are, if you happen to get dementia, you tend to really be able to postpone it until much later in life, and it's quite compressed
Mhm.
in the life cycle. So
And let me throw in the economic component of this terrible outlook. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, and the cost of care is enormous.
unbelievable.
It's just enormous. It is truly staggering.
It is truly staggering, but it's certainly a case that we're going to need to see more federal involvement in terms of supporting and the ways in which Medicare, for example, could be expanded to support dementia care. I
Yeah.
think it's going to come because the costs are just so extreme,
Yeah.
and the markets are quite variable in terms of being able to seek services. So I will tell you that my mom had dementia and she lived in Yuma, Arizona. The opportunities for care and caregiving there were much different than when we moved her to Seattle, where she had many, many more options, right? So this is the
Right.
kind of dilemma that all families face when they're confronting this disease.
Yeah, sure is. And there we have another big cartel, the pharma companies and the
Yes.
medical industrial complex. So if we can bust that up or disrupt it to some extent, that would be great.
I mean,
because
I think
the cost is just it's absurd. I
yeah.
mean, the cost of care is absurd. It
I
really
mean,
is.
I can easily reduce the risk of dementia if I increase the levels of education in the population.
Hmm.
Really
Yeah.
not hard. So, but we rarely look at those kinds of a social exposure kinds of solutions, and we don't actually recognize them, I
Hmm.
think. But if you really want to tip, have a dramatic impact at the population level, you're going to have to move to those upstream levers to really make a difference.
Which are the longer term plays, you
To
mean,
the
right?
longer term
Yeah.
plays, yeah.
Yeah.
It's much easier to have a new drug, right?
Well, unfortunately, we live in a society, whether it be on Wall Street or in politics or just generally, in life, it's instant gratification. It's, the next quarter. That's all anybody cares about. Their term in office. It's just that's just not the way it works. Sadly, it's quite sad, really.
But
So,
Jason, one thing to remember, for at least for me, my colleagues say, "Well, you talk to the press a lot." I said, "Yes, I do." They said, "Well, why do you do that?" And I said, "Because I want to get facts out and evidence out." And I think the more, and we're assembling a lot of evidence and a lot of facts. And while I can't tell people what to do with it, it is important to get the facts and evidence on the table. And I think ultimately, I'm going to have to trust in some system that people will make use of these facts and evidence, even in ways that I may not ever envision. So I think
yeah.
we can't be too pessimistic about this,
Right.
right?
No, I hear you. I tend to complain a lot, but at the same time, I always say my quote, "It's an amazing time to be alive." It truly is. I mean, there are so many technologies and incredible things being discovered, and I just hope that innovation continues and we see a lot more of it. So, well, you're at UT, and Dr. Mark Hayward, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you, Jason.
We appreciate having you.
I appreciate you calling me. Thank you.